In the spring of 1894, the Missouri Ozarks were a place of quiet beauty and uneasy silence. The land rolled with endless hills covered in oak and hickory, and fog hung over the valleys like a ghost that refused to leave. Life here was simple, or at least it seemed that way. Families farmed the land, children walked miles to school, and people trusted their neighbors because they had to. But behind that trust, there was always something else, an unspoken understanding that in the Ozarks, secrets could survive longer than people. That year, the air carried more than just the scent of rain and earth. It carried whispers about strange lights seen over the hollows, about screams that echoed at night from deep in the woods, and about a family that had stopped showing up to church without a word. The people of Dent County didn't ask too many questions. They had learned long ago that curiosity in these hills could be dangerous. But as spring turned into summer, silence began to feel heavier, and what once felt peaceful now felt watched. On the edge of those hills stood a homestead belonging to the Talbot family, a husband, a wife, and their 3 children. Their home sat far from the nearest town, perched near a creek that twisted through the woods like a dark vein. From the outside, everything looked as it should. The fences were mended, the fields plowed, and smoke rose from the chimney each morning. But people who passed by said they never heard laughter anymore, only the sound of the wind and sometimes something else they couldn't quite name. Samuel Talbot was a tall, broad man, quiet but respected. He wasn't known for kindness but for hard work. His wife, Clara, was softer, gentle with the children, polite to the few neighbors who came by. To most, they looked like any other family making their way through life in the harsh countryside. But those who knew them better said Clara's eyes were always tired, and her hands shook when Samuel was near. They said she'd once been talkative and warm, but over the years she'd grown quiet, almost hollow. The Talbots had moved to the Ozarks 8 years earlier, leaving behind a small town near St. Louis. No one knew exactly why they left. Samuel told people it was for the land, for a new start. But some said he'd been running from something, a debt, a fight, maybe worse. No one pressed him for answers. In those days, people didn't ask questions if the answers might trouble them. Their nearest neighbor, an old trapper named Jonas Brill, lived about 2 miles away. He was the first to notice that something about the Talbot homestead didn't sit right. He'd see Samuel walking the fields late at night, even when there was no moon. He'd hear faint hammering sounds coming from the barn long after midnight. And sometimes, just before dawn, he swore he could see Clara standing by the creek, still as a statue, staring into the water. When he waved to her, she never waved back. But life went on, as it always did in the hills. The children, Eli, Rose, and little Thomas, were rarely seen in town. Clara did most of her trading herself, bringing eggs, butter, and cloth to the general store once a month. She'd smile politely, talk about the weather, and leave quickly. One spring morning, she came in with a bruise just below her jaw. No one said a word, but everyone saw it. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Grady, tried to ask if she was all right, but Clara just smiled and said she'd tripped on the porch. Then she turned and left, holding her shawl tight around her shoulders. By early June, strange things started happening around the Talbot land. A few cattle belonging to neighbors went missing. One was found near the woods, its carcass torn apart, though no one could say by what. Someone claimed they saw lights moving between the trees late one night, too low to be lanterns, too steady to be fireflies. Others said they heard singing, faint and eerie, like a woman humming a lullaby deep in the forest. But when men went to look, they found nothing, only silence. The sheriff in town brushed it off as superstition. He said folks in the Ozarks always let their imaginations run wild when the nights got long. But even he couldn't ignore what came next. In late June, Jonas Brill rode into town and told the sheriff he hadn't seen a single sign of the Talbots for over a week. The fields were untended. The animals were unfed, and from the road he swore he could smell something strange, sweet, like spoiled fruit. The sheriff, a weary man named Amos Heller, gathered a few men and rode out the next morning. When they reached the Talbot property, they found the front door wide open. The air inside the house was heavy and still. The table was set for 5, but the food on the plates was untouched, hardened with mold. A chair lay on its side. A window was shattered, and in the corner of the room a clock had stopped at 3:17. No one was there, not Samuel, not Clara, not the children. It was as if they had simply vanished. The only sound was the wind through the broken glass and the slow drip of water from the roof. The sheriff called out their names, his voice echoing through the empty rooms, but there was no answer. Behind the house, the barn door hung half open. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. Tools were scattered across the floor. And in the center, nailed into the beams of the ceiling, was something no one wanted to describe. That night, the men rode back to town in silence. Whatever they'd seen or thought they'd seen, none of them spoke about it out loud. All they said was that the Talbot family was gone and what remained was not meant for anyone to see. Word spread quickly, but no one dared go near the property again. The church held a service for the family, though there were no bodies to bury. Still, some said they could hear crying near the creek on quiet nights. Others claimed that when the fog settled over the valley, they could see shapes moving near the Talbot house. Shapes too tall, too thin, and too still to be human. The mystery of what happened to the Talbots spread across the Ozarks that summer. Some said it was murder. Others said it was madness. A few whispered about something older, something the land itself had taken back. But one thing everyone agreed on was this: whatever happened on that land in 1894 was not meant to be understood. And though years would pass and the forest would grow over the house until it was nearly gone, the silence that started that summer never really left. It stayed in the air, in the soil, and in the hearts of those who remembered. Because in the Ozarks, stories don't end. They sink into the ground and wait. The summer heat in the Ozarks that year seemed heavier than usual, as if the air itself carried a warning. By mid-June, the Talbot homestead had started to feel like a place where the air didn't move right, where every sound seemed sharper, closer. Samuel had grown more distant, his voice lower and slower, the kind that made people stop what they were doing when he spoke. Clara no longer went into town as often. When she did, her hands shook while she counted coins, and her eyes darted around as if someone might be watching her. Their marriage, once quiet and functional, had turned into something darker, something fragile that no one outside the family could see but everyone could sense. Samuel had become obsessed with money, with the land, with the idea that the farm wasn't producing as much as it should. He'd stay awake late into the night, going over notes in a small ledger, whispering to himself about numbers that never added up. Clara would stand by the door, afraid to interrupt him. Sometimes he'd slam the book shut and accuse her of wasting money, of not working hard enough, of hiding something from him. At first, the fights were small. He'd raise his voice and she'd lower hers. Then it got worse. One night, the oldest child, Eli, tried to stop them. He was only 12, but he'd stepped between them, his small body trembling as he begged his father to stop yelling. Samuel had turned to him slowly and said in a calm, frightening tone, "This is between your mother and me." After that, Eli didn't speak to his father again unless he had to. The neighbors didn't know about the arguments, but they began to notice strange things. A letter arrived for Clara one morning, delivered by the storekeeper's boy. Samuel took it before she could touch it, read it alone, then burned it in the yard. Clara stood by the window as he did, her hands clutching her apron. Later that night, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the woods. The next morning, the children were seen collecting pieces of a broken lamp from the porch. There were whispers about who might have written that letter. Some said Clara had family in St. Louis, a sister she hadn't spoken to in years. Others thought it came from a man she'd known before Samuel. No one knew for sure, but whatever it was, it had planted something poisonous in Samuel's mind. He began to question her every move, watching her even when she wasn't looking. He accused her of hiding letters, of lying, of bringing shame to the family. Clara stopped answering. She just moved through the house like a ghost. Money was tight. A harsh winter the year before had ruined part of their crop, and the small savings they'd brought from the city were nearly gone. Samuel had borrowed money from a man in town, a man known for lending with cruel interest. When the payments fell behind, that man came out to the farm. The conversation was short, tense, and when he left, Samuel followed him to the edge of the property. They said no words anyone could hear, but the man never returned. A week later, his horse was found tied near the old mining road. The man was not. Something inside Samuel seemed to change after that. He worked harder, but not in the way that made sense. He dug trenches that led nowhere, spent nights in the barn hammering boards together, muttering under his breath. The children whispered that he was building something. Rose, the middle child, said she heard him talking to someone who wasn't there. She told her mother, but Clara only told her to stay inside after dark and never go near the barn again. The local pastor, Reverend Mills, came by one Sunday to check on them. He found Samuel standing in the yard, covered in dirt, his eyes bloodshot. When the Reverend tried to speak about faith and patience, Samuel interrupted him and said, "Faith doesn't fill a man's belly." Clara stood on the porch, silent, her face pale as the moon. After that day, the Reverend never returned. Inside the house, things were unraveling faster than anyone could imagine. Clara had started writing in secret, a small notebook she kept hidden under the floorboard beneath her bed. In it, she wrote about her fear, her loneliness, and the strange things Samuel had begun saying. He spoke about voices in the woods, about something that was watching him, guiding him. He said the land wasn't cursed, it was chosen. Clara didn't understand what he meant, but his words grew more disturbing with time. He began calling the creek the mouth, saying it whispered his name at night. Sometimes the children would find him outside in the middle of the night, standing barefoot by the water, staring into it for hours. When they tried to call him, he wouldn't answer. In the mornings, he'd act as if nothing had happened. By late July, Clara had grown desperate. She'd secretly packed a small bundle, some clothes, a bit of money, and a photo of her children. She planned to leave when Samuel went into town for supplies, but he never went. He stayed home that whole week, barely sleeping. He began carving strange symbols into the wood around the house, on the doors, the beams, even the children's bed frames. He said they were to protect the family. Clara begged him to stop, saying it frightened the children. He only stared at her and said, "It's not them I'm trying to protect us from." Eli began keeping a knife under his pillow. He told Rose that if their father ever tried to hurt their mother, he'd stop him. Rose begged him not to talk like that, but she, too, had seen the look in their father's eyes, something that didn't seem like him anymore. The day before everything changed, Jonah's Brill rode past the house and saw Samuel digging near the creek. The hole was deep, too deep for planting or fixing anything. Jonas called out to him, but Samuel didn't look up. Later, when Jonas mentioned it in town, someone joked that Samuel was burying his worries. No one laughed. That night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees and thunder shook the hills. Neighbors said they heard shouting from the Talbot place, but no one dared go out in that weather. The next morning, the storm had passed and the sky was strangely clear. Smoke rose from the Talbot chimney, thick and dark. By noon, it stopped. No one saw Clara again after that day. In the days that followed, the children were seen wandering near the woods, pale and silent. When Jonas tried to speak to them, they said their mother had gone to see her sister and would be back soon. But Jonas noticed something in their eyes: fear, confusion, something that didn't belong in children. Samuel began coming into town more often after that, though he looked worse each time. His clothes were dirty, his hands raw. He bought large amounts of salt, rope, and kerosene, things no one asked about but everyone noticed. He told the storekeeper he was purifying the land. Meanwhile, the strange lights began appearing again in the woods. People said they saw shadows moving around the Talbot property after dark, tall, thin figures that moved too smoothly to be people. One farmer claimed he saw Samuel talking to someone near the barn, but when he called out, the second figure disappeared. Clara's sister, living near St. Louis, wrote to the sheriff in August. She said she hadn't heard from Clara in months and feared something had happened. The sheriff promised to look into it, but by the time he reached the Talbot place, it was too late. The house was empty, the beds were made, the children's clothes were neatly folded, and the air smelled of something that didn't belong: iron and smoke. In the corner of the kitchen, someone had written words into the wall with a trembling hand. Only one word could still be read: forgive. The sheriff found no bodies, no signs of struggle, only the faint impression of footprints leading toward the creek and stopping halfway down the hill. The rest had been washed away. That was the last anyone ever saw of the Talbot family. Some say Samuel went mad and killed them. Others believe something in those hills drove him to it, that the whispers he heard weren't just in his head. The sheriff tried to keep the story quiet, but rumors spread like fire. People left the area, saying the land was cursed. And even years later, travelers who passed through the Ozarks at night said the same thing: that if you stood by the creek and listened closely, you could still hear the faint sound of someone crying, mixed with the low, steady rhythm of digging. Whatever happened that summer in 1894 wasn't just a crime. It was something deeper, a slow unraveling of a man's mind, a family's trust, and the fragile line between faith and madness. The night it happened, the Ozarks were swallowed in a storm that felt like the sky was tearing itself apart. Rain came down in heavy sheets, pounding against the roof of the Talbot house until the wood moaned beneath it. Lightning flashed through the windows, throwing long, warped shadows across the walls. Inside, the air was thick, hot, stifling, and tense with something that couldn't be named but could be felt by everyone in the room. Samuel sat at the table, his face lit by the flicker of a kerosene lamp. His eyes were dark, fixed on the flame, his hands clenched around a small, leather-bound book, the one he'd started keeping after Clara stopped talking to him. It wasn't a Bible, though that's what he told the children it was. Its pages were filled with strange marks, rough drawings, and sentences written over and over, as if repetition could make them true. "The land will take what it's owed," he had written on one page again and again, until the words blurred into black smudges. Clara stood by the door, clutching her shawl, trembling. She decided that night she would leave. The bag she had hidden beneath the bed was ready, packed with what little she could carry. She had waited until the storm came, thinking the sound of thunder would hide her footsteps. She thought maybe Samuel would fall asleep, that maybe she could take the children and go before dawn. But he wasn't asleep. He hadn't slept in days. When she moved toward the hallway, he spoke without looking at her. "Where are you going, Clara?" His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that only made her fear worse. She froze just to check on the children. He looked up then, and the lamp light caught the hollow look in his eyes. They were bloodshot, wide, and distant. "They're fine," he said. "They've been chosen, we all have." Her throat tightened. Chosen for what? He stood slowly, pushing the chair back across the wooden floor. It scraped with a long, harsh sound. "You don't hear it, do you? The whispering, it's calling us." He pointed toward the window where rain streaked the glass. "The creek knows, it's been waiting." "Samuel, please," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You're not well. We can go into town in the morning. We can find someone to help." He smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was hollow, detached. No one can help what's already begun. A crack of thunder shook the house. Upstairs, one of the children cried out. Clara turned to go to them, but Samuel grabbed her arm. His hand was rough, shaking, but his grip was strong. "You can't take them," he said through gritted teeth. "You'll ruin everything." She tried to pull free, but his fingers only tightened. "Samuel, you're hurting me." Another flash of lightning filled the room, and in that split second, Clara saw the knife on the table. It wasn't one of her kitchen knives. It was longer, sharper. She didn't even remember him bringing it into the house. He followed her gaze, then reached for it slowly. She panicked. "Don't do this," she begged. "Think of the children." "I am thinking of them," he said quietly. "This is the only way to save them." She screamed then, a sound that cut through the storm and made the children rush down the stairs, their eyes wide, their bare feet slapping against the wood. Eli reached the bottom first. He saw the knife in his father's hand, saw the terror on his mother's face, and without thinking, he ran between them. "Stop it," he shouted. "Leave her alone." For a moment, Samuel hesitated. The storm roared outside, wind rattling the windows, but inside everything went still. His hand shook. The knife lowered slightly. Clara saw it, saw that small flicker of doubt, and she reached for him. "Please, Samuel, don't let this take you." But the flicker didn't last. Something inside him snapped. He stepped forward, grabbed Eli by the shoulder, and shoved him aside. The boy hit the floor hard, crying out. Clara screamed and lunged forward, and in the struggle that followed, everything happened too fast for thought. The blade flashed, a sound, half gasp, half sob, escaped her lips, and then there was only silence, broken by the relentless pounding of the rain. When Samuel realized what he had done, he staggered back. The knife clattered to the floor, the handle slick with blood. Clara fell to her knees, her eyes wide in disbelief. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her breath shallow, trembling. The children screamed, but she didn't. She just looked at Samuel, her face pale, her lips trembling, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking violently. "Clara, Clara, I didn't mean." She tried to speak, but no sound came. Her hand slipped from his, her body collapsing against the floor. The sound of rain on the roof filled the silence between her last breath and Samuel's first scream. It wasn't the sound of anger. It was the sound of something breaking inside him, a raw, guttural noise that didn't sound human. He screamed her name over and over as if saying it could undo what he'd done. But the house didn't answer. Only the storm did, howling through the cracks of the windows, swallowing his cries. The children ran to her, crying and shaking, calling for her to wake up. Eli tried to stop the bleeding, pressing his hands against the wound, his small voice whispering prayers he could barely remember. Rose screamed for help that would never come. Thomas hid under the table, sobbing until his voice gave out. When Samuel finally stood, his face was empty. There was no rage, no grief, just a strange calm. He picked up the knife again and looked at it for a long moment. Then he walked to the window and stared out at the darkness beyond the glass. "The land will take what it's owed," he whispered again, as if repeating it made it true. He turned to his children, his voice soft now. "She's not gone, she's waiting by the creek. We have to go to her." Eli shook his head, crying harder. "No, she's dead. You killed her." Samuel's eyes flickered, but there was no guilt in them anymore. "No," he said, "I freed her." The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, blowing out the lamp. The room went black, except for the flashes of lightning that came every few seconds, each one lighting the horror in white, burning bursts. Samuel walked to the door, motioning for them to follow. When they didn't move, he said it again, louder this time. "We have to go. The water's calling." Eli tried to stop him, grabbing his arm, but Samuel shoved him hard. The boy fell back, hitting his head against the floor. He didn't get up. Rose and Thomas cried, clutching each other as their father opened the door and stepped out into the storm. He dragged Clara's body with him, her lifeless hand trailing through the mud. The children screamed for him to stop, but the storm drowned them out. He moved down the path toward the creek, lightning flashing over his figure again and again until he looked less like a man and more like a shadow moving through the rain. By the time the children followed, barefoot and shaking, he was already knee-deep in the water, holding her in his arms. His voice was low, almost tender. "It's all right," he said. "It'll be over soon." The creek churned violently around them, swollen from the rain. He lowered her slowly into the water, whispering something they couldn't hear. When Eli screamed again, Samuel turned toward him, his expression soft but distant. "You'll see her again," he said. "We all will." And then, without another word, he disappeared beneath the water. For a few moments there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the rush of rain and thunder. Then Eli ran into the water, calling for his father, for his mother, for anyone to answer. But the creek only carried the sound of his cries away. By dawn, the storm had passed. The creek had calmed, running dark and silent. The house stood quiet, the windows shattered, the front door open. The children were nowhere to be seen. Only the muddy footprints remained, leading from the door to the water and stopping at the edge. When Jonah's Brill came the next morning, he found the knife still lying in the kitchen, rusting in a pool of dried blood. The lamp had fallen over and the wick burned to ash. Upstairs, 3 small beds were empty, their blankets neatly folded. The sheriff arrived hours later, and though he searched the property, he found nothing more than silence and the heavy feeling that something terrible had happened there. Something that went beyond madness, beyond reason. Down by the creek, he thought he saw something move beneath the water. Just a shape, dark and slow. But when he looked again, it was gone. Only the ripples remained, spreading outward until the water was still again. That night the storm clouds returned, and the wind carried the faint sound of children crying somewhere in the hills. Some said it was just the echo of the storm. Others said it was the Talbots, still calling out from the place where the water took them. But no one ever went near that creek again. For days after the storm, the valley remained eerily quiet. The air felt thick, heavy with something no one could name. The Talbot homestead sat still in the gray light, its windows dark, its fields half flooded from the rain. Birds wouldn't land on the fences. Even the animals seemed to avoid the place. The creek, swollen and brown, carried branches and debris from the storm, but some said it carried more than that they'd seen bits of cloth tangled in the roots along the bank, or what looked like hair caught between the rocks. No one wanted to look closely enough to be sure. When Sheriff Amos Heller and his men finally returned to the property, they did so with unease. It wasn't their first time seeing death, but this felt different. It wasn't just violence, it was madness left behind like an echo. The sheriff stood in the kitchen, staring at the blood-stained floorboards. The room smelled of rust and damp wood. He touched the knife handle with his gloved hand, then looked out the window toward the creek. The water glimmered faintly in the sunlight, calm now, pretending innocence. "Search the banks," he ordered quietly. "Start with the shallows." They found nothing at first, no bodies, no signs of where the family had gone. Only scattered footprints that faded near the edge of the water. But a few yards downstream, one of the men called out. Something pale was caught against a fallen log. When they pulled it free, it was a woman's handkerchief, torn and soaked, with the initials CT stitched in the corner. By nightfall, the sheriff decided to end the search. "The water took them," he said, his voice low. "They're gone." But the look in his eyes said he didn't believe that. None of them did. News spread fast through Dent County. People spoke about it in hushed voices, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid the family might walk through the door at any moment. At first, there was disbelief. No one wanted to accept that Samuel Talbot, the quiet, hard-working man who'd built his home from nothing, could have done such a thing. But as the details came out, the knife, the blood, the missing bodies, the disbelief turned into something colder. Fear. The church held a small service a week later. Reverend Mills led it, though his hands trembled the entire time. He spoke of sin and forgiveness, but his voice cracked when he said their names. People bowed their heads, not just in mourning but in guilt. They had all seen something, known something, that uneasy feeling that had followed the family for months, but none had stepped in. Jonah's Brill couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Samuel by the creek, digging in the rain, his face half hidden by shadows. He told himself he should have done more, should have gone to the sheriff sooner, should have spoken to Clara when he saw her alone. But it was too late for should have. The sound of rain now made him sick. Every night he swore he heard knocking at his door, but when he opened it, there was never anyone there. The sheriff filed his report as best he could. "Murder-suicide," he wrote, though he hesitated over the words. The truth was, he didn't know what had happened. The lack of bodies made the case impossible to close. The land was searched for weeks, but the woods were thick, the creek deep, and the Ozarks had a way of swallowing things it didn't want found. When the summer heat came, the stench from the homestead became unbearable. The townsfolk burned what they could, furniture, clothes, anything soaked in blood. The house itself was left standing, though no one lived there again. They said the ground didn't want it. The crops wouldn't grow right. Animals refused to cross the fence line. Children dared each other to run up to the porch and knock on the door, but none ever lasted more than a few seconds. They said if you listened closely, you could hear a woman humming from inside. Some said it was Clara. Others said it was something else entirely. By fall, the story had spread beyond Dent County. Newspapers from St. Louis printed short articles about the tragedy in the Ozarks, painting Samuel Talbot as a man driven mad by isolation and hardship. They called Clara a poor wife trapped in the wilderness. The tone was sympathetic, almost romanticized. No one in the Ozarks liked that. The people who'd known the Talbots, or thought they had, knew there was nothing poetic about what had happened. It wasn't a story, it was a wound that didn't close. For the next few months, strangers came to see the place. Reporters, photographers, even preachers who claimed they could cleanse the land. They always left before sundown. Some said the air near the creek made them dizzy, that they heard whispers when they got too close. One man from Springfield came to buy the property, planning to build a sawmill, but after spending one night in the old house, he left before morning. He told the sheriff the walls breathed at night. The sheriff stopped going out there altogether. He said the land wasn't meant to be disturbed anymore. His deputies didn't argue. For Clara's sister, the news came like a nightmare. She traveled from St. Louis to identify what little the sheriff had collected: her sister's handkerchief, a child's shoe, a photograph found in a drawer. She wept as she held them, whispering Clara's name again and again as if saying it might bring her back. She asked to see the creek, but the sheriff told her not to. "Let them rest," he said. When she left, she took the photograph with her. In it, the family stood in front of their home, Samuel looking serious, Clara smiling faintly, the children lined up in their Sunday clothes. It was taken only a year before everything went wrong. She kept that photo by her bed for the rest of her life, but never spoke of it again. Years passed, and the story of the Talbots became more legend than fact. Some said Samuel had been cursed, that he'd found something buried in the hills, an old relic, or a grave that should have stayed untouched. Others said he'd gone insane from guilt after killing a man for debt. Every version twisted the truth a little more until no one could tell what really happened. But not everyone forgot. Jonah's Brill, old and frail, would still talk about that summer sometimes. He said the land itself had changed after that night. The trees grew darker, the air colder. He warned travelers not to camp near the creek. "You'll hear her," he'd whisper. "She still sings for her children." In the years that followed, there were more strange disappearances near that part of the Ozarks. Hunters who never returned. Horses found wandering without riders. Campfires burned long after their owners were gone. People stopped going near the valley altogether, calling it the Hollow of Echoes. The sheriff died not long after his retirement. On his desk, his daughter found a locked box with his old case notes. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just 4 words written in shaky handwriting. She forgave him anyway. No one knew what it meant. By the turn of the century, the Talbot house had collapsed into itself. The roof caved in and weeds covered what was left. But the well remained, and so did the creek. Sometimes travelers passing through would hear laughter, thin, distant, like children playing in the fog. Those who heard it never stayed long. For the people of Dent County, life went on as it always does after tragedy. But something in them had changed. They trusted each other less, locked their doors more, and when storms came, they kept candles burning until dawn. No one forgot what had happened on that land, even if they pretended to. The Talbot name faded from records, from sermons, from memory. But the story lived on, in whispers, in warnings, in the uneasy way people looked toward the woods when the wind blew just right. Because the Ozarks have a long memory. They don't forgive easily. And the ground where the Talbots lived, where they died, never quite let go of their footsteps. To this day, when rain falls hard enough to drown out every other sound, some say you can still hear Samuel calling from the creek, his voice low and desperate, searching for the wife he can never find. And sometimes, if you listen longer, you'll hear her answer, not in anger, not in fear, but in something that sounds almost like forgiveness. Years passed, and what had once been a story of tragedy faded into a kind of folklore. Dent County moved on, or at least pretended to. The Talbot farm was swallowed by the earth, its fences fell, its chimney collapsed, and nature reclaimed what belonged to her. Yet, even as the grass grew over the ruins, the story never truly disappeared. It lingered like a stain that no rain could wash away. People stopped speaking the family's name aloud, not out of respect, but out of fear that saying it might summon something best left forgotten. But time, as it always does, reshaped everything. By the early 1900s, the sheriff's report, filed away in a drawer of the old courthouse, became nothing more than a curiosity. Historians, journalists, and thrill-seekers stumbled upon it decades later, fascinated by the chilling simplicity of the words written there. All presumed deceased, cause undetermined. The ambiguity left room for imagination, and the legend grew teeth. There was never a trial, no official justice to serve. Without bodies or confessions, the law could not move. The Talbots simply became ghosts in the system, both literally and figuratively. Yet perhaps that was the cruelest justice of all, to have one's sins forever suspended in speculation, one's name synonymous with evil and tragedy, unable to defend or explain oneself. For the townsfolk, it was a different kind of punishment. They bore the guilt of silence, of seeing the signs and turning away. Samuel's descent hadn't been sudden. The whispers of his temper, his isolation, his wife's bruises, and the children's strange absences had been there all along. But in the small, proud towns of the Ozarks, people didn't interfere in another man's household. It was none of their business. And so their restraint became complicity. Jonas Brill, one of the last who truly remembered, died in his sleep years later, his mind haunted to the end. On his deathbed, he reportedly muttered, "She forgave him, but the earth never did." Those words spread through town like prophecy. If there was any redemption to be found, it came not through law, but through reflection. The Talbot tragedy became a cautionary tale whispered to children. Don't turn your back on a neighbor in need. Don't let silence grow in your home. It was as if the story itself became a vessel for repentance. By the 1920s, the tragedy of the Talbots had transformed into folklore. Traveling preachers and storytellers used it to warn against sin and secrecy. In sermons, Samuel was painted as the embodiment of man's failure to resist his darker nature, a husband turned monster, a father corrupted by pride and guilt. The newspapers, too, found new angles to exploit. One sensational article called it the curse of the Ozark Hollow, claiming that the family had been haunted by an ancient evil buried beneath their land. Others called it the devil's debt, suggesting Samuel had made a pact he couldn't repay. People believed what comforted them most. It was easier to blame curses or madness than to confront the uglier truth, that ordinary people, when consumed by fear and shame, are capable of unspeakable things. In later decades, writers and filmmakers would revisit the case, transforming it into fiction, their versions more romantic than real. They turned Clara into a tragic heroine, Samuel into a symbol of masculine decay. But those who still lived in Dent County knew the truth was simpler and therefore more terrifying. No curses, no demons, just a man who lost his soul quietly over time, and a family that paid the price. The Talbot tragedy did more than scar one family, it changed the fabric of the community. In its aftermath, neighbors began looking at each other differently. Conversations about domestic violence, though still whispered, started to surface. People began to understand that the home, once considered sacred and private, could also be a place of horror. The local church took a more active role in outreach, visiting isolated families and widows in the hills. Law enforcement became more vigilant about disappearances and reports of abuse. The case, though never solved, quietly altered how the town handled human suffering. But in a more intangible way, it changed the soul of the region. Dent County was no longer just a sleepy farming community, it was a place marked by shadow. That reputation lingered for generations. Even in modern times, hikers who wander too deep into the woods near the old creek swear the land feels off. as if something there remembers what happened. The descendants of those who once knew the Talbots moved away, ashamed of their ancestors' inaction. The house was eventually reduced to rubble, and the county paved a new road over part of the land. Yet even concrete couldn't erase the unease. Locals say that on foggy mornings, the air there smells faintly of iron, of rain and blood. At its heart, the story of the Talbot family isn't just a crime, it's a mirror. It reflects the fragility of morality, how isolation breeds rot, and how silence can be as deadly as a weapon. Samuel Talbot was not born a monster. He was made by circumstance, by pride, by a community that looked away. Clara, too, was a victim not only of her husband, but of a society that left her voiceless. In every tragedy, there's a moment where intervention could have changed the outcome. But in this case, no one spoke, no one reached out, no one dared to disrupt the illusion of decency. That collective failure is what haunts the story most deeply. Morality, the story reminds us, is not about grand gestures. It's about small acts of courage. The courage to ask a neighbor if they're all right. The courage to confront cruelty when it hides behind closed doors. Without that courage, even the most peaceful towns can become breeding grounds for darkness. By the time the century turned again, only the legend remained. The land where the Talbots lived became known as Black Hollow. No one could recall when the name changed, but it felt fitting. Local teenagers would camp there for a dare, claiming they could hear a woman's lullaby echoing through the trees at midnight. Some historians argued that what happened at the Talbot farm reflected a wider societal sickness, a clash between traditional values and the isolation of frontier life. Others saw it as a story of repression, of what happens when emotions, pain, and guilt are buried instead of spoken. Yet for all its interpretations, one truth remained constant. Human beings left alone with their secrets can destroy themselves. The Talbot tragedy stands as both a story and a warning. Justice was never served, not by courts nor by heaven, but something deeper was learned. The people of Dent County carried the burden of that silence, and in doing so, changed the way they saw each other. Every generation since has told the tale differently. To some, it's a ghost story. To others, it's a parable about pride and punishment. But beneath all versions lies the same question, a question without a satisfying answer. How far can the human heart bend before it breaks? And perhaps that is where the story truly ends. Not in the law books, not in the whispers of ghosts, but in that lingering unease we feel when we think of the Talbots. Because we know, deep down, that what happened to them could happen anywhere. Not because of monsters in the dark, but because of the ones we let grow quietly inside us, fueled by fear, silence, and the desperate need to be left alone. And in that way, the Talbots never truly vanished. They live on in every story we tell to make sense of the darkness, reminding us that evil is not always loud. Sometimes, it's just the sound of a house gone quiet before the storm.